Hey there, 2016! How's it going? I'm ready for a brand spanking new year. What's that? I'm gonna be sick the week after I finish writing the script for this review? And then my power's going to go out? Ha! I see. So it's gonna be one of those kinds of years, huh? Alright. Bring it on. Let's talk Resident Evil. I am a massive fan of survival horror, and I can't count the number of hours I've spent researching and studying the art of scaring the shit out of people sitting at home on their couches. Silent Hill, Clock Tower, Dino Crisis, Alone in the Dark, the early games that is, Sweet Home, Fatal Frame, System Shock 2, Condemned Criminal Origins, all of which are excellent series and all of which have hit rough patches in the recent years. No more is this prevalent than the king of survival horror in general, Resident Evil. Now, I know there is a huge argument to be made about who the crown really belongs to, with much respect being thrown to the Silent Hill series. But for as much as I love it, Silent Hill isn't as popular and well known. It doesn't stand as the representative of survival horror. Resident Evil does. Everyone knows this game series. It's the first game people think of when you say survival horror. Hell, it coined the phrase with its original release back in 1996, and it is by far the most far-reaching and highest-grossing horror game series in gaming at present. So where am I going with this? Remember how I mentioned that the survival horror genre kinda hit a snag back when I listed off all those different names? Yeah, they've hit a rut, a real big rut, and nowhere more is this present than with Resident Evil. A little backstory on this. Resident Evil as a franchise has progressively become more and more action-packed, especially since Resident Evil 4, though there were hints of it back in Resident Evil Code Veronica and even Resident Evil 3. Which, some action makes sense with the setting. Most of these characters were or are in the armed forces or part of a police force, and they were in desperate situations, so extreme actions can be warranted in small spurts. However, Resident Evil 4 changed the entire paradigm by having a more action-oriented, accuracy-based combat system, in which the main character was regularly throwing himself out windows, barring doors, and generally being more of an action hero. It was very well received though, earning dozens of accolades the year it was released, and it ended up radically changing the entire field of survival horror. Gone were the days of cramped corridors, tank controls, and tricky camera angles. Now everything's outside in the next-gen lighting systems, with smooth flowing control schemes, and over-the-shoulder camera controls like every other single generic action shooter on the market. Now, of course, there was fan backlash to this, even back with Resident Evil 4, which was critically acclaimed. In fact, a lot of fans like to point to Resident Evil 4 as the point where the franchise went to shit, but what people often forget is that the game was, in itself, fantastic. Sure, it was more action-packed, but it still had scares, and most importantly, atmosphere, which was the key ingredient in survival horror. That is where Resident Evil 5 started to fuck up, and Resident Evil 6, oh god no, I don't even think they were trying. Safe to say, fans were livid that the franchise that they came to for scares was suddenly taking pages out of Michael Bay's Wet Dream Diary. What was then proposed was the Revelation spin-off titles, which would emulate and strive to recapture the first half of the franchise tone while holding on to most of the mechanics of the newer titles. And you know what? Revelations 1, pretty damn good. Not only did it manage to nail the oppressing, dour atmosphere of Resident Evil 1 on board the Queen Zenobia, but it also managed to introduce a new virus and a new conspiracy that felt rather fresh. It was a game I kept having fun coming back to. Revelations 2, on the other hand, well, that's what we're here to talk about today. I really wanted to like this game. Honestly, I did. I liked Revelations 1 so much, it managed to bring back so much of what worked in the original games, and I was hoping that Revelations 2 would be able to continue that trend. But it didn't. Instead, we got a generic by-the-numbers, over-the-shoulder shooter with very few original ideas and palette-swapped enemies from the last game. The gameplay is fine, yes, but it has issues. The biggest being, it's not that scary. In fact, it's not scary at all. Horror is a very hard thing to convey, even more so when you have an AI partner and action-based controls. When inserting an assisting character, you have to answer one question. Why? What purpose does it serve in the whole of the game, and how does that reflect the purpose of the game in general? Moira as an AI partner makes no sense. As a character, she's fine, I suppose. I'll get to that in a minute. But I honestly think that as a partner, her inclusion is purely superfluous. You could easily demote her to a reoccurring character and achieve roughly the same effect as the game ultimately did. Hell, I'd argue with less screen time, the character would have probably been better developed. As she is now, she adds nothing to the character dynamic between her and Claire. Mechanically, she functions no different to Claire, with the exceptions that she can't use guns, carries a flashlight, and has extra inventory space. At any point, Claire could have taken the crowbar and flashlight away from Moira and most likely fulfilled the same niche without a hitch. The only thing her constant presence does is detract from the horror experience. Revelations 1 was actually pretty smart about this. In both sections of the game, Chris and Jill, the most veteran of veterans in the series, were paired with two equally as experienced characters who knew their way around weapons, and we got a feel that they all had good working relationships. So, when things become weird and confusing and a mystery is posed, both characters are treated as equally confused and somewhat alarmed, which vicariously raises the player's unease. If two trained professionals are unsettled about the situation, ones who have gone through similar events at least once before, it makes the player begin to dread what is going to come next. Here, though, we really get nothing between the two. In fact, by taking away one character's experience, it oddly makes the situation more calmed. What little dynamic we get between them is that Claire is pretty easily keeping her shit together, while Moira is understandably panicked. This has an interesting effect. If you're a newcomer to horror games, which, I mean, this isn't the best game to start with, you'll relate to Moira, who is then comforted and protected by Claire, so you feel safe. If you're a veteran, like me, you'll relate to Claire, in which case you're comforting Moira and saying, listen, I've been through this shit, just sit back and watch me be awesome. The two mentalities run counter to the fear factor of the game. Which is odd because I think they nailed the two character dynamic with Barry and Natalia. Now admittedly, even with those two the game isn't all that scary, but the character beats between them all feel rather genuine, and I can get behind the two as protagonists. But I'm getting ahead of myself, and I've probably lost a few of you. Let me take it back a notch. So what is the story of the game? Well, Claire Redfield, the 3-time bioterror disaster survivor from Resident Evil 2, Code Veronica, and Degeneration, is going to a company party at the headquarters of TerraSave, a company developed in the wake of the Raccoon City incident from the original games to help manage bioterrorism around the world. While there, she meets up with the daughter of Barry Burton, one of the original survivors of the Spencer Estate incident in the very first game. Seeing as how Claire's brother worked with Moira's father, the two naturally know each other and greet each other just before the entire party roster is kidnapped by Spec Ops soldiers in black BDUs. Both wake up on an island overrun by undead abominations, and naturally have to find a way to escape before the many hazards of the island get the best of them. As the two try to escape, we periodically cut to 6 months later where Barry Burton himself arrives on the island chasing a radio distress call that Moira makes at the end of episode 1. When he docks, he finds a younger girl named Natalia, who seems to have superhuman abilities to detect the presence of monsters on the island. From there, the story twists and turns and ultimately reveals that the mastermind behind this whole incident is Alex Wesker, the sister of longtime series protagonist Albert Wesker, who is seeking a means by which to become immortal. To do this, she's gathered potential candidates from TerraSave with the help of Claire's boss, Neil. These candidates may or may not react to fear and succumb to the new virus T-Phobos in a vetting process to determine who she can transfer her mind into. She discovers that Natalia would be the best candidate, and at the end of Claire and Moira's story, she successfully implanted a copy of herself into Natalia. By the end of Claire's storyline, Moira is presumed dead, while Alex's evil tower lair collapses and Claire escapes. Meanwhile, Barry learns that his daughter is most likely dead and goes on a rampage through the island in order to try and kill Wesker for both the betterment of humanity and for revenge. At the very end of the game, there are two different possible turnouts, depending on how you handled a boss fight in episode 3 or 4 of the story. If you did what I did first and react like a normal fucking human being by having Claire react 100% self-sufficiently, you get the bad ending, where Moira ultimately stays dead at the end of the game, and the first Alex Wesker dies only for the Alex persona in Natalia's body to fully awaken and become a terrifying little shit stain. Alternatively, if you switched to Moira during the episode 3 boss fight and had her crawl for Claire's gun, she will instead somehow survive being crushed by several tons of concrete and steel, and go on to save both Barry and Natalia at the last minute 6 months later, which leads to the real final boss where Claire shows up in a helicopter and helps Barry blow Wesker up with an RPG. That story might seem solid on paper, but there's a lot of issues in the details. Let me frame it to you in a different way. Claire Redfield is kidnapped by the remnants of Umbrella and imprisoned on an island that's laced with undead. From there, she teams up with a bitchy emo psychic with daddy issues who she has to constantly protect throughout her journey, and is only saved in return during token moments where it's cinematically fitting but not logical from a story standpoint. The two try to find their way off the island while dealing with intricate and bullshit traps set up by the mysterious female overseer with blonde hair and a brother complex, ultimately culminating with the sidekick being crushed and Claire being forced to leave them for dead. All during this, a paternal figure manages to track down the island in the wake of Claire's romp and has to fight with the aftermath of Claire's actions while searching for his loved one, only to find that a Wesker has been the person behind this whole mess the entire time. Sound familiar? It's the plot to Code Veronica all over again. But, repetition of a past game's plot aside, there are still even more issues. Let's start with the fact that the main villain's plot makes roughly 0 sense. Alex wants to become immortal, and figures that by implanting her memories and personality into a new host, she could achieve that goal. Fine, good, that's a pretty good motivation, and it checks out in terms of suspension of disbelief. She has a machine that can do it, and that doesn't need to be thoroughly explained. But then she goes about finding candidates, and here's where she lost me almost immediately. What qualifies a good host? This is an integral question that's never quite answered throughout the game. They say that it's someone who can resist the T-Phobos virus, who can overcome it and not become a horrific monster. But we see throughout the game that Claire, Moira, and Natalia all manage to resist the virus through the entire journey. Not once do they show any active symptoms, which leads to me questioning why she just cut the selection process short when full conclusions on all the candidates haven't come in. Or is the requirement someone who doesn't feel fear? If that's the case, why Natalia, since her bracelet is constantly red throughout the campaign, means she's experiencing constant fear. But then there's a paper stating that she doesn't feel fear at all, which means that the bracelet on her wrist is broken or something because it turns red in response to fear. Why not Neil as a candidate, especially if she was planning on killing him anyway? Hell, his bracelet didn't change from green at all throughout the story. Doesn't that mean he's, immune to fear? Even if he did know that what was going on from the get-go, it wasn't like he or Alex were exerting any kind of control over the afflicted. When he was fighting them off, he was in real mortal danger the entire time, meaning this man was an utter sociopath who just did not feel fear. And it wasn't a gender thing either, considering the abductees were from all genders and race, with 2 Caucasian men and 2 Hispanic men, along with Claire, Moira, Gina, and Natalia. And going on from there, who the hell signed on for the job of kidnapping the entirety of TerraSave's party roster? Judging from the opening cutscene, this must have been a 20 to 30 person job to pull off, and someone has to be footing that bill. Umbrella by this point has been debunked for about 8 years, and most of their assets have been divvied up and sold off. Hell, they had to invent Tricell in order to explain where funding for bioweapons had come from. In Code Veronica, Umbrella was still in the middle of collapsing and still had most of its faculties at the ready, including trained guards, helicopters, and a designated prison island that was outside the government regulations. The best explanation we get is, Alex stole money from Spencer, that noob, lol. Someone would also have had to strategically scatter all the people around the island, while there were rage-filled cannibalistic mutants running around. Who the hell would sign on for that? Especially since Alex needed enough of the mutants alive in order to test the candidate's reaction to fear. It's practically a suicide mission. And that also begs the question of why each person was left where they were. What was the purpose of leading them through a convoluted series of locales to gauge their reaction to fear? You only need 2 or 3 pits of monsters to judge that, and it's not like they're in short supply. That raises my next largest complaint about the game. The afflicted are never really explained. I mean, they are, but nowhere near as comprehensively as earlier games. One of my biggest complaints about Resident Evil 5 and 6 is that we never got a detailed scientific look at how the viruses functioned. For example, how is it transmitted? Is it by bite, or air, or is it just injection or ingestion based? I mean, since T-Phobos has a T in its name, we could assume bite transmission like the regular T-virus. But we've seen alterations and improvements on the T-virus function differently, like the G-virus, which has to be incubated in a host, and a compatible one at that if you want the best results. I still don't know what the fuck Ouroboros is as a biological weapon, and God help you if you try to figure out how the C-virus works, though at least with that one we know it functions through all transmission vectors. The best we get is that T-Phobos activates in response to norepinephrine levels, which I guess is the hormone that regulates fear. I don't know, I couldn't be bothered to look it up. And how come so many afflicted have metal torture devices strapped to them? I know it's supposed to be explained away by saying that the islanders who became the afflicted were tortured and experimented on beforehand, but that doesn't account for all of the afflicted in the city, just the ones in the mines in the tower. In fact, this island doesn't make too much sense either, now that I think about it. Are there just islands that live completely isolated from the world these days? This is supposed to be 2011, and these people obviously have contact with other people. Did no one in Russia question why a settlement of miners suddenly went missing? Did Alex read the communications somehow and explain that everyone was away on vacation or something so as not to arouse suspicion? Who found Claire after she jumped 200 feet into the freezing depths of the Russian Ocean while injured? She can't have drifted that far away from the island before she was rescued, or else she would have drowned. In that case, why did it take 6 months and a delayed radio signal to find it? What was keeping Barry from rushing out there to find his daughter? In fact, how come Claire didn't tell him that Moira was dead? She can't have been in the hospital that long, and even if she was most likely capable of speaking at some point, so telling him what happened would not have been an issue. Hell, apparently he had been a briefing on the island, its experiments, and the overseer when he sailed out there. So what kept him? Why does Natalia know, or at least think, that Moira is dead, when in fact she was unconscious and having her brain reprogrammed 20 minutes before the tower started collapsing? Speaking of Natalia, why is Alex so intent on killing her? She says her plan and that everything leading up to the final battle had ended up being mistakes. Well, that doesn't make any sense for someone who has apparently been very obsessed with Kafka, a man whose work explored the entire argument of dual existences in depth. You can chalk it up to her going crazy, yes, but honestly I found it lazy the way they tried to retcon her motivation last minute in order to justify her behavior after 6 months. It would have been more interesting, far more interesting, if instead she decided to facilitate the implanted consciousness in Natalia, growing to fruition in order to create 2 of herselves. One that would be free to experiment and try to attain ascension, and another to keep her legacy living on forever through the brain transfers that she had developed. A failsafe, so to speak. And then we come back to Moira and the problems with her as a character. I've already explained that she doesn't make any sense from a mechanical perspective, and while she functions on a plot level, she really doesn't act like a human being either. We know almost nothing about her outside the fact that she has a broken relationship with her father ever since shooting her little sister by accident. and that she swears more than a sailor on shore leave. We get only one other humanizing moment with her, other than her standard "no, save yourself" speech at the end, and that's when she's comforting Natalia for all of 30 seconds. The only 30 seconds, mind you, where Claire is unlikable because she doesn't apparently know how to talk to kids. Which is wrong, because in Resident Evil 2, she managed to develop a rather close relationship with Sherry almost immediately. They just needed this moment in here because they realized they'd botched developing Moira as a character. Then let's address the problem with Moira's sudden character turn in episode 3, provided you manage to switch to her during the boss battle and crawl towards the gun. There wasn't a single moment of lead into that scene. There was no build, and while in real life situations that may be more than warranted, here it doesn't fly. For one, this is Resident Evil, a series where people can fling electricity when infected with a virus, a plot point so stupid they reused it in Resident Evil 6. For another, Claire is more than capable, if not more efficient, at killing the Neo Ouroboros monster herself, which, I mean, if she could, she would, without Moira's help. This character moment feels completely forced and out of nowhere, and anyone who'd bother role-playing in this sequence would have never even remotely thought about having Moira go for the gun. Not once did Claire or Moira talk in depth about what happened. Not once did the two bond on any level other than griping over the fucking stupid things happening around them. All of Moira's dialogue can be compared to a 12-year-old who just learned what the word fuck meant and just decided to use it in every single sentence to sound cool in front of senpai. I honestly don't know a thing about Moira. Hell, I know more about Steve Burnside than I do about her. Steve fucking Burnside. He also had a genuine arc as a character throughout the story, as opposed to one moment where his entire personality did a flip. He started out as a cocky young man trying to impress Claire thanks to an inferiority complex developed after being imprisoned with his father. Then, after finding his father and having a complete emotional breakdown, he confided in Claire, and the two bonded over the fact that they were in a hopeless situation and needed to keep each other going. He becomes more honest and less pompous, and eventually, when the time came and he was infected with the T Veronica virus, he wrestled control from his own feral thoughts and sacrificed himself in order to help Claire escape. He went from being a show-off to being a real hero over the course of the game. Compared to Moira, whose entire arc has exactly 2 beats to it. The first being, I hate my dad, and then, oh, I actually love my dad. And before you say it, yes, I know the extra episode, The Struggle, was added and it gave her character a little more meat to her bones. But honestly, it came too little too late, considering the main campaign should have to stand on its own merits. That said, it wasn't bad for an extra episode, and I'll get more into it later, but I think Capcom showed a little bit of their hand too much where their inspiration for Moira came from. Is it too late to note that Revelations 2 came out in the wake of the success of The Last of Us? Which, I mean, it's a shame because her design is so interesting and it leaves a lot of personality to explore. Why don't she and Claire talk about things other than what's happening on the island? You might say that's a stupid idea, but remember, they're on that island for hours, maybe even days. Neither of them mentioning anything ordinary? They never talk about what work would have been like at TerraSave had Moira not gotten kidnapped, or about Moira's personal life in the wake of her falling out with Barry. Claire never mentions how Chris is doing, or what normal life is like for either of them. Not a single peep out of her about motorcycles, or Sherry, or even how similar the situation is to Rockford Island from Code Veronica. In fact, if you really wanted to get in on this, what was the point of having it be Claire as the main character? She really has no bearing on the plot, even if you believe she was the one who told Barry where Moira was. In fact, if you really wanted this game to be more interesting, have the main character be Jill Valentine. No, really, think about it. This is coming off Resident Evil 5, where Jill was brainwashed into being Wesker's personal slave. She could be visiting Moira at the TerraSafe conference because she knows Barry and his family directly, and is maybe seeking help from TerraSafe psychologically, in order to cope with the trauma over being someone's unwilling slave. She and Moira are kidnapped, more Jill than Moira because Jill has proven her ability to survive what Albert put her through. She then has to keep Moira safe and lead her off the island, all while dealing with the pressure of being put in another outbreak scenario. Along the way, Moira and her could talk about the mistakes they've made and how Jill has chosen to live with them instead of run, like Moira has from her father and family. On top of that, revealing that it's actually Alex Wesker in charge would cause some significant trauma to Jill's already fragile psyche as she realizes that Africa wasn't the end of her struggles against the Wesker family. The struggle to stop someone from being dominated like she was and ultimately failing with Natalia, coupled with the fact that she ended up getting Moira killed, would leave her near catatonic with guilt and unable to properly communicate once she is returned to the world outside the island. Then Barry would do everything he can to find his daughter, and the game would progress as it already did, only with Claire replaced with Jill as necessary. That would have actually made for a far more compelling game by the end, and even answered a few questions, like why Jill wasn't ever with Chris during the events of Resident Evil 6. It would be easy to explain, saying that she was still dealing with emotional issues 2 years later, and had decided to take an extended medical leave from the field in order to better her own health. Maybe show that the characters in these games act like humans and not action heroes? Not to mention, it would have probably been good for branding purposes. Jill's by far one of the most popular characters in gaming, and she's already pretty closely associated with Revelations 1. It should have been second nature to include her, but for some reason they went with Claire, and almost nothing at all really happened that directly involved her as a character. To top this all off, some of the gameplay can get pretty aggravating at times. Almost all of the mechanics are nerfed from the get-go in order to allow a skill tree to exist, which doesn't really need to in the end. The game would have been a lot better and a lot more fluid if they had just given us all these abilities at the beginning of the game, especially with the fully functional dodge option locked at the very end of the tree. There were 2 or 3 segments that felt like claws on a chalkboard. They were so difficult, like this one where you have to run through a gate and have Moira open the door on the other side. Admittedly, I found out that you could use a flamethrower in order to stem the flow of enemies, but it was so poorly explained that I ended up ignoring it completely. Which ended up leading to several retries. Not to mention, using that flamethrower would have knocked me out of being able to pick up an important item later as Barry, so had I known, I would have avoided it anyway. On top of that, there are the last 2 episodes with Barry and Natalia. What boring, uninteresting, slow, and rather annoying puzzles were installed in order to pad out the game. The first being a block moving puzzle where you move a crate from one end of the map to the next, and the other being caves filled with gas where you have to come up for air several times in order to survive without suffocating. But those are just my grievances. What did I actually like about the game? While my pool of good points is significantly smaller than the bad, I have to say there is some merit to this game. For one, the segments featuring Barry and Natalia are typically better, mechanically and character-wise, than Claire and Moira's segments. Natalia's ability to see enemies through walls with her sixth sense makes the game far more tactical, especially when enemies with specific weak spots and even enemies who are invisible begin to pop up. Balancing the trade-off of playing as Natalia and Barry was almost always a difficult challenge that was usually pretty fulfilling. Aside from that, Barry as a character is always entertaining, with his stupid one-liners and cheesy sense of justice. Even more so though, considering we're now seeing him in a role we've never really seen him in before. While his family as a character point was effectively utilized in the original game as blackmail from the original Wesker, we now get an interesting mirror where one of his family has been, at least by his knowledge, killed by another Wesker. We get to see not only an old grudge match flare up, but also the kind of character he's become. He doesn't really change throughout the game, but for him that's not the purpose. This is a game showing who he is now, after mulling over Moira's disappearance for 6 months, and the lengths that he's willing to go through in order to both find her and get the revenge for her apparent death. As a character study, his portions of the game are brief and effective, especially combined with Natalia as a daughter figure to show us that he's normally a good dad, while also allowing us to see that he's flawed over how he's handling the situation with Moira and her sister. He's also the first survival horror character I've seen come actually well armed to a situation, sporting from the get-go his handgun and assault rifle and his signature 357 Colt Python. Natalia's arc is also probably the most intriguing thing in the game, with the implication even in the good ending that she's slowly succumbing to the Alex personality that's been shoved into her mind. It makes us question her every step of the way, and I actually had to pause the minute she said this.
It's like a movie. I wish I could live here.
Speak for yourself.
I've had my fill of mansions.
Because I wasn't sure if it was Natalia speaking or Alex in that moment, considering that Alex had that place built. Some of the character dialogue at times could also be funny. I know as an old school Resident Evil fan, I certainly got a solid chuckle out of this exchange.
Oh my god, are you okay?
Yeah, that was almost a Claire sandwich.
Does Barry tell everyone that story?
The ending segment was also a lot of fun, effectively utilizing the switching character perspectives and also giving Claire and Barry their own badass moments, cheesy one-liners included.
Come at me, she-whisker!
God, I love how he says that line with such a straight face. I bet they had a lot of laughs about she-whisker behind the scenes in recording booths. The extra DLC was also pretty good. While the game was shipped in 4 serialized episodes, there were 2 extra episodes later that came bundled with the full game set I bought. The first is The Struggle, which explains what the hell happened to Moira in the interim between Claire's segment and Barry's, and gives us a slightly better glimpse into her as a character and why her heel turn towards Barry happened. It doesn't give us too much more to work with, but I am ultimately grateful that someone decided to put more effort into her character. Obvious similarities to The Last of Us aside. It also introduced us to an interesting hunting mechanic, wherein the level retries are tied to the amount of food you manage to catch by killing rabbits in another game. While I never ran out, the threat of my save being completely wiped out and having to start from scratch was something that added a nice layer of tension to the game that seemed to have gone missing in the era of checkpoints. And then there's the DLC story Little Miss, which details what happens to Natalia after waking up from her 6-month coma up until she meets Barry. This may be my favorite section by far, purely because of how they utilized Natalia's scene mechanic. Natalia's partner in this segment is dark-dressed Natalia, who is very obviously Alex's existence inside Natalia's mind. It's a purely stealth section where only Alex can sense monsters, and the player has to navigate Natalia around them without being caught. If she's seen, she dies, and it's back to the last checkpoint. It's an interesting system because Alex can't interact with the world and also can't be seen by the monsters, but the reverse is true for Natalia, making the mechanic an even more careful balancing act than Natalia's sections with Barry, and it ends up making the game feel tense and scary due to the fact that Natalia is effectively alone. No one can save her or comfort her. Hell, all Alex and Lottie, her stuffed teddy bear, do is keep trying to depress and mentally batter Natalia. It has some really dark content in there, and it perfectly sets up Natalia as a character once she meets Barry in-game. If anything, the dreamlike atmosphere and the genuine sense of dread and unease the segment causes makes it worthy of at least watching a walkthrough, if not playing through for yourself. So would I recommend this game? With a heavy heart, no, I would not. For all the good there is in this game, there is so much bullshit that we shouldn't have to stand for. But if you want to try it, go right ahead. I got it on the cheap during the Christmas Steam sale, and I'd say that it's at least worth $7. As for the Resident Evil franchise, I'm not entirely sure where it's headed. Rumors are still circulating about Resident Evil 7, and the RE2 remake has been announced as being under development by the same team that remade RE1 and made RE0. So there's hope in the future that Capcom may look and return to the days of yore where Resident Evil was king of the genre. But after this and Resident Evil 6, it's hard to say. This has been Raymond McNeil. Thanks for watching, and as always, catch you on the flip side. Hey there, if you liked the video, please hit the like button down below. And if you want more content like this, feel free to check out my channel and maybe throw a subscription my way. And if you're feeling especially generous, check out my Patreon page. It's the support of you, my faithful fans and followers, that keeps me going, so keep an eye out for future content on the channel. Until next time, everyone.